the library was my space, and there was just so much.
To the Harbor Grace excursion with the boys to have a time.
All right. Well, thank you so much, everybody, for coming. I'm so delighted to be on stage with these lovely authors, Genevieve, Kate, and Heather. We're here talking about historical fiction at a time when it seems like we're living history in a strange, weird way. And I think it's wonderful to be able to reflect on history as often to understand our contemporary times. But just to sort of set the scene a little bit, I know often we talk about these things in terms of genre, like it's a way to kind of define books or, how to select them at the library. But when it comes to historical fiction, what is your own kind of relationship with it? I understand for you, Genevieve, this is something that you've loved since you were, quite young.
Nope.
No? Okay. Right. History was not a thing, but historical fiction was something you came to.
Yes, I've always loved historical fiction, but I focus on Canadian history because I never learned it growing up. So I felt like in history class through high school, I learned about American history and British history and a little bit about the fur trade. And that's all I remember from it. So now that I'm older, I seem to be finding how fascinating Canadian history is. And there's a lot more stories to tell.
Kate, I understand this is your first historical
It
fiction.
is.
So
It's
could
my-
you tell me a little bit about what is your own relationship with this field?
So, I read very widely and certainly have always really enjoyed historical fiction and have lots of people whose work I really enjoy. Kate Morton is one that springs to mind, but lots of these two people here, obviously, lots of people who write historical fiction who I enjoy. But I don't think I really set out necessarily to write. It wasn't a conscious choice. This time I'm doing historical fiction. It was just the story that it turned out I wanted to tell, and the character that kind of got in my head was telling a story in the past. And so I didn't, so here I am now. I'm a historical fiction writer, which is great. I'm in great company. I'm so happy to be here. But it wasn't intentional in that way.
Right. And Heather?
I've loved historical fiction since I started reading longer novels in my teens. Kate Morton was one of them, and Philippa Gregory another. So they've also been kind of an influence on how I have chosen to structure my novels and write my historical fiction. But I'm just a history nerd, and I kind of always have been. I studied history in school. I did a master's in history. I love history, and I just think we have so much to learn from it. And as you were talking about living in these very strange historical times, there's a lot we can learn from the past about our present and our future, and we ignore it at our collective peril. So I think we are in the privileged situation of being able to write historical fiction now and explore some topics that may be pertinent for the present and the future, and kind of explore some important themes that are maybe not quite as historical as we thought they were, without getting too into the weeds on it. But it is sort of personally and politically important for me.
And we'll come to that idea of reading your books. I was kind of like, wait, this isn't that historical. This is actually could be written right now. But Genevieve, can I, begin with you? Could you tell us a little bit about the book? For those who might not, is this your 10th? Yes. In the 10th year?
10th of Canadian fiction, yes.
Right. So could we just set the scene up? Let's cast this movie a little bit. Let's set the scene. What's happening, and how this idea came to you.
It's a little history, a little mystery. So that's this is my first go at a murder mystery, but it's all basically historical fiction set in Canada. The story is a dual timeline set in 1929 and 2024. And the main character in the first part is Rosie Ryan, who is a young Irish girl who lives in an area of Toronto called The Ward, which was basically a slum area where the immigrants would come in and live until they could finally escape it. And she lives there, and she wants to work her way up in the world. And so what she wants most of all is to work as a chambermaid in the brand new Royal York Hotel, which is being built right there, right in front of her. and her story goes on from there. And then in 2024, Bridget is a building inspector, and she loves old architecture, old buildings, and history in general. And she's been assigned as building inspector to the Royal York. And once she's there, she's discovering a lot of things that she did not expect to find. And so the two stories wind together that way. And it's actually, I had the most fun writing this book than I've ever had with a book. I love all my books because the characters are so fun to me. But this one was just a little different. It's not based on a huge event or area or person. It's based on something very particular. And it's based on one particular character who could never leave my head. She was so fun. So I love that part about the book.
Could I ask who?
It's Rosie Ryan, and Rosie Ryan she starts out as a 17-year-old girl, basically doing laundry at the old hotel and wanting to move up, and she lives in the ward with her grandmother, and it's the first time writers talk about hearing characters in our heads, which is weird, and we all know that, but we hear them or we feel the pressure or something, and Rosie Ryan was the first one who I actually felt. She was basically shoving me, saying, this is my story. I need to show you what we're about to write together. And she just stole my heart right away. So she was a lot of fun to write, a lot of fun to follow around, basically. She was in charge, so.
I love that. Okay, and we're going to talk a little bit about following that history, especially that Toronto, very specific Toronto history. Kate, could I ask you, City of the Muse. So now this is sort of set partially ancient Egypt-ish, and then we go to the ROM. And these are sort of areas that have, ancient Egypt I loved even as a child, that whole sort of
Me
world.
too. Yeah.
And then going to the ROM and just, I can spend hours over there. So could you tell us a little bit about how this whole, the book, a little bit about the book and then how you came about it.
Absolutely. So I should maybe start by saying that I'm a lifelong archaeology nerd, and that in grade 6, when we had to do a public speech and the kids were doing, My Dog Spot and my summer vacation, I did death and burial in ancient Egypt. And my mom was like, okay, honey, whatever you want. So this is, and I'm sure that love was really influenced by the King Tut exhibit that came through Toronto in 1979. Did anyone else see that? Yeah, right. It was a huge event in Toronto, and it really, I remember as a child, looking in those display cabinets and thinking, this is another world entirely. I'm hooked. So those special interests have found their way into this book, and this is a dual timeline historical mystery. We've got, in 2019, we have an archivist. She's a young woman who's sort of one of those hinge moments in life where you sort of think, how did I end up here? And this isn't really working, and how do I get unstuck from here? And she gets swept.
That's Maddie.
That's Maddie, exactly. And Maddie finds a historical artifact that gets her very interested in a story, which is the other part of the book, in 1903, which is an excavation of a site in Egypt in a desert area that is very known for papyrus deposits. And I found this story because there was a headline about 10 years ago about a papyrus scandal. Yes, it's true. Wow. There are papyrus scandals where an Oxford Don had been investigated for allegedly dipping into this trove of extremely valuable ancient papyrus and selling it to an American billionaire who was creating a museum of the Bible in Washington. And I thought, this is like dark academia, billionaire skullduggery, like ancient books, Library of Alexandria, like sign me up. And that was the genesis of this particular book.
And the second timeline?
Second timeline is on the excavation in 1903, 1904, and the protagonist is a woman named Helen Gardner, who is an expert in papyrus excavation, restoration, and translation. And she kind of represents a whole generation of women who had these very specialized academic skills that that really made it these incredible contributions in the early days of archaeology as an academic discipline, but whose history has really been lost up until quite recently.
You also open with a quote with Sappho, and then that also is a layer in the novel. Could you talk just a little bit about that whole sort of layer?
Sure. Without any spoilers, I think what I want to say is that one of the things that was most interesting to me to learn as I was doing the research for this book was that there's a really good argument to be made that the most valuable treasure that's come out of Egypt in all these years, including King Tut's treasure, is papyrus. And that's because so much of classical literature was lost in the Library of Alexandria fire, and just because, Greek and Roman artifacts, it's a long, long time ago, right? But the Greeks and the Romans colonized Egypt and were there for about 800 years, and they brought their literature with them. And it was recorded on papyrus, and a lot of classical literature that we now have that had been actually completely lost to time, but we have it now because it was discovered on papyrus in Egypt around 1900. And the writer that we recovered the most of, that we really didn't have at all, was Sappho. And so that plays a role in this book.
Okay, all right. That's a lot of intrigue in this. Okay, and then now we come to Liberty Street. So this is a women's prison that you take us into the world of Heather. So could you talk a little bit about, now at the end you have a little kind of you sort of give us a little behind the scenes about how you were once driving and you literally had to stop and start taking notes on your note app while your child was asleep in the backseat. But could you talk a little bit about just, again, the story, and then what drew you to start writing it?
Sure. So it's also a dual timeline, and I only just now realized we've all written some element of mystery.
Yes.
Hadn't occurred to me until this conversation. We've seen each other all weekend, learning something new all the time about our work. So in 1961, I have a character who is a junior editorial assistant at Chatelaine magazine, women's magazine in Canada. It's been around for, I think they just celebrated their 90th anniversary recently. And she's very eager, very green as well, very naive, and wants the scoop that's going to break her career open. And she gets wind of abuses at this women's prison that was in Liberty Village until the late 1960s. And she decides to go undercover there to learn about the abuses and try to break this story, thinking that will launch her career.
This is Emily.
Emily, yes. And of course, tragedy and very bad things ensue as she is trying to break that story. And then in 1996, we have Detective Rachel Mackenzie, who comes across a body in an unmarked grave in a small town Ontario cemetery. And she has to figure out who the body is and why it's there. And Rachel is kind of battling her own demons along the way. And yes, the body does connect to the prison, and no, I won't tell you how. You'll have to read it to find out.
It's a fine mystery. You kept me guessing until I was like, it could be a couple of people over here who yeah.
I was definitely manipulating you, so I'm glad that it worked. Some red herrings here and there. I've learned from the best. And yeah, the idea for it actually came to me back when I was on maternity leave with my first child. I was writing The Secret History of Audrey James, and that was the summer of 2021. And there was a period of time where he wouldn't sleep unless we were driving around in the car. So I would drive around in the car, and we live semi-rural, and I ended up stopping to pop a soother back in next to this rural cemetery, which rural cemeteries fascinate me, always have. And it was this tiny little town, and there was a row of houses along one side of the cemetery. And I just had this thought of what an interesting place to live, having a cemetery as sort of your front lawn. And then I had this thought of what might you see? You'd have to not be a very superstitious person, or you could see some pretty emotional things happening with burials. What might you see if you lived across the street from a cemetery? So I went home and wrote the prologue, and I had no idea where that was even going to go. And I was doing some research. We've talked a lot the past few days about falling down these internet rabbit holes. And I came across a reference to the Andrew Mercer Reformatory, this women's prison in Toronto. And I thought, where do I know that from? And it rang a very distant bell in my sleep-deprived brain, all the way back to my undergrad, where I had read the memoir of a woman named Velma Demerson, who was a prisoner at the Mercer in the 1930s. And she details the atrocious conditions and the abuses that she and her baby suffered there. And I made the connection in my head, and so I started doing more and more research. And at that point, actually, I was working on Audrey James, but I said to my agent, can I write this one instead? And she said, no, because you're contractually obligated to write Audrey James. But she was like, just bookmark it, like calm down. I'm pitching her new ideas every 6 weeks, and she's like, could we just finish writing the one that we're working on right now? But there's so much history, there are so many stories to tell, and they're always popping into my head. So then I was driving around again a few weeks later after doing some of this research, and I had this prologue that I'd written, and I ended up pulling over to the side of the road because it just sort of hit me like a lightning bolt, and I realized how those stories connected, and that there was going to be this connection with the Mercer Women's Prison to this cemetery, and away we went. So I was starting the research in 2021, and then wasn't able to actually sink my teeth into it until about 2024. So it's been a long time coming for me, this one.
Okay, so props to you. When I was sleep deprived with my kids, I was not thinking up like multiple timelines. It was not me.
Contractual obligation. It's a powerful motivator.
All right. So we have these sort of, in each case, you have these really compelling women in really intriguing circumstances. These are women I wouldn't have necessarily thought of before. We have a chambermaid, we have, an archivist, and true crime, we've Mayor of Easttown, we've kind of seen a couple of them, but still, nevertheless. Could we talk a little bit about these women and the jobs that they did and kind of bringing them to life? How is that whole process for you?
Well, when I started writing about the ward, it is obviously an impoverished area. It's gone from an immigrant neighborhood, a community of them, and it's expanded so much that it's a slum where families have come in and bred like bunnies, and they've had to build homes in their backyards, which would replace the cows and the pigs and the chickens they'd had there before, and just expanding. And when you've got 12 people sleeping in one room, everybody needs to get out, and everybody needs to do whatever they can. And in Rosie's case, she had been washing laundry in the old Queen's Hotel, which they then knocked down to build the Royal York. And she had chapped hands and bleeding hands, and still she would go every day because that's what it took. And then when the old girl got knocked down, she began making pennies wherever she could, running laundry and chores to people in the ward, doing whatever she could. And her friend Bianca she's Italian, and the two of them have a great little discussion going on there. But Bianca is from a family of way too many people, and she takes care of all the babies, and she takes care of 6 of the babies for the neighborhood, and there's 3 more coming, and she just is losing her mind. But she's not quite old enough, but when she can, she wants to be a chambermaid as well. But when she arrives, she's trying to always look for another sneaky little way that maybe she can get it going a little faster. It was a desperate time for these people, a desperate search for anything they could get their hands on. So, and it was interesting comparing them, showing up for work at 5:30 and these rags basically, but then they got to change into their uniforms, which is the best part of their day. And they would come across all these long cars and men in bow ties and women in their well-heeled clothes, and everybody shining and shimmering and knowing and seeing the difference between the hardworking people that were looking up at them and the others who were not really looking at them, and the difference between them. But I felt it was nice knowing with Rosie and her friends that as they were doing these things, they never actually were jealous. They were never, oh, those people don't deserve it, I deserve it. They weren't like that. They were pleased just to be moving up one step at a time. And for me, it took a lot of strength for these women to move out of the space, the swamp where they were. So
There's a lot of sort of class kind of issues that kind of come into that, you know, digging into that. Could you talk about writing that kind of?
well, I think it's the difference between the ward and the Royal York. And I should point out something here with the Royal York. I had pretty much finished this book when I went to the Royal York and said I would really love to sit down with someone and get deeper into it and talk into little teeny little bits and whatever you could share with me. And they said, what's this book about? And I told them, well, you can't use our name, they said. And I said, but I wrote everything. Every brick is about the Royal York. And so, to clarify, my lawyers at Simon & Schuster went over it with a fine-tooth comb, and I told them I'm writing everything about the Royal York, but they said you must not use our name, so that's why you will read about the Dominion Hotel instead. But it was very interesting watching with the classes, watching these people from the ward move up, and then watching the Royal York, which became, it was 28 stories, and it was over 1,000 rooms. It was the largest hotel in the British Empire, and it came out of nothing.
Yeah.
It was a time when Toronto was rising, and other cities across Canada were rising out of nothing and becoming these huge behemoth places that they are now, just the beginnings of all that. And to be able to compare that to the ward, which had been there since the mid-1800s, and was being raised one neighborhood at a time as the city would take the properties over and build on top of them. The ward is still here, but it's buried. There is one building remaining from the ward, which I got to visit today. And the rest is underneath the Eaton Center and underneath the old City Hall. It's still there, but it's buried as so much of our history is. So.
Which building's still here? Which one's still here?
It's 87 Elm Street, and it was originally a workhouse, and now it is the home of a YWCA. And I sat in there for a while with the lady there and talked about the past of this building. She didn't realize it, but there was a picture there of a dozen women who I believe were from the ward. They didn't spell it out, but they said they were living nearby. And they had been offered work or lessons, like domestic service lessons and useful things for them to learn. And they had come to this building. After it was done being a workhouse, it became this YWCA where they would train the women to work. So it was... it's done a lot of things, and it was really neat to see it still there. Like the front is there, and there's a plaque on the front, McLaughlin House, I think it was, or Laughlin House. And there was not much going on inside, but the outside was pretty great.
I have to say, I've been to the Royal York a couple of times now, and I see the carpets. I don't think I quite see them the same way now, the red carpets. Yeah, so in your case, there's this building inspector, and there's this... not building inspector. I'm getting mixed up with my... there's an archivist, and there's, like in the older timeline, another woman sort of documenting. There's somebody who's painting. There's all these women doing really... there's also... Nora Alcott, like there are all these fascinating women characters. Could you talk a little bit about writing these women we don't usually see?
In my books you do, because I'm like very interested in women's history and kind of women's intellectual history in particular, and how women who are a little bit different find a place in the world that is non-traditional. And so that's kind of a thread in all of my books, actually, no matter what timeline I'm writing in. But in this case, I was, one of the really interesting things about the field of archaeology is that, of course, for centuries, there was like treasure hunting, right? Which is not archaeology, to be clear, but there were people, sort of men, descending into parts of the world where ancient civilizations had been and, taking loot out of the ground and taking it back to their museums, and we really live with the legacy of that today in all of our museums. But around 1900, the late 1800s, early 1900s, people got interested in archaeology as an academic discipline, something to think about, something to write about, something to start to build processes around. And that was around sort of understanding not the treasure itself, but the context around those civilizations, the buildings, the strata, like the layers of earth and what they contained, the potsherds, like all the little pieces that told you about how people lived. And that had not really interested anyone until around this time period. And when archaeology became a discipline that people wanted to study and take seriously, it was like a brand new science. And up until that point, women they'd been allowed to attend university here and there, but very rarely granted degrees. But archaeology became one of those very early disciplines where women could attend and they could get degrees because it was brand new. And people hadn't really thought it was important enough to exclude women from, to be candid, yet, right? And so one of the first university departments was at the University College of London, and it was established with a gift from a woman who'd been an Egyptologist and a great explorer. Her name was Amelia Edwards, and if you read, there's a great series that was many years ago with a character called Amelia Peabody, and if you've read the Amelia Peabody mysteries, that character is based on the real Amelia Edwards. Amelia Edwards was a Brit. She traveled all over the world. She founded this fund called the Egyptian Exploration Fund, and she traveled all over North America, lecturing about the Egyptians, the ancient Egyptians, and all of the amazing things about exploration and archaeology. And she amassed a lot of money for Egyptian exploration in this more careful way. And when she died, she left a gift to the University College of London to establish this department in archaeology, and a condition of the gift was you have to let women get degrees. You have to admit them, and they have to have full participation, and you have to send them to the field, and they have to be able to do this. And so a very early generation of women was out there in the field, like really creating the field from the very ground up, which none of us know, and isn't that cool, right? And so these women in the past are all women who kind of represent some of these really interesting skills that women brought. Like a lot of, if you open up a temple, the paintings start to disappear as soon as the air hits them, right? But we have wonderful paintings and drawings of what the temples looked like. Women did those for the most part, right? And we have these amazing catalogs of like pottery and bone and small tools. Women collected those. Right, for the most part. And women were often the people who put together the monographs that the male archaeologists signed off on. They did a lot of work behind the scenes to really help us understand these civilizations. And so Helen is a papyrus expert, right? And Iris is a painter. And there's another character, Nora Alcott, who is kind of a scandalous figure based on a real character. She's a mistress of a very wealthy man, and they sail up and down the Nile, and she kind of manages these excavations that they're funding. And women did a lot of that too. A lot of the famous archaeologists in the beginning were wives, right, or mistresses, who were running the admin of these excavations. And so you'll meet some of these women in my book.
It's just such fascinating detail over there. Heather, now you in your acknowledgements credit somebody you used to actually scoop ice creams with to sort of lead you to one of your central characters. So could you again, I know we now see women detectives and women journalists and stuff, but Doris Anderson, this is such a character, editor of Chatelaine. Could you talk a little bit about these women and writing these women and their histories and their stories and what that was like?
Yeah, in the author's note in The Secret History of Audrey James, I tell a little anecdote. When I was in grade 8, and we were learning all about Confederation, and I realized that we were exclusively discussing the men and the male politicians. And I put my hand up and asked my female teacher, what were the women doing? And I got sent to the principal's office for impertinence, for daring to ask what the women were doing. So my very supportive parents were exceptionally proud of me, took me out for dinner at Pizza Hut and said, keep asking that. So, thank you. So that really is kind of the question that I keep at the back of my mind as a little bit of a North Star when I get lost in a book that I'm writing. Like that's driving my career, is this question of what were the women doing? Because they are not always in the history books, but they're there between the lines if we kind of read into it. Their absence is notable, so what were they doing if they are not in these history books? So with this book, one of the things that inspired me the most, years ago, I came across a reference to a journalist named Nellie Bly. And there's some people nodding, and one of her many claims to fame was that she went undercover as a journalist at mental institution on Blackwell's Island. And she was there for 10 days to uncover the horrific conditions of how those inmates effectively were treated there, those patients. And she published this series of articles that were then compiled into sort of a memoir called 10 Days in a Madhouse, and I highly recommend it. The audiobook version is particularly good. But when I learned about Nellie Bly, I thought, that is so dramatic and cool, and I can't say a word I want to say right now because it's a bit of a curse, but like what an amazing woman to have done this. And I really wanted to fictionalize her story somehow. That was probably a decade ago. So when I came across this idea for Liberty Street, I knew like immediately that's where I was going to plug that idea in. So I'm going to have this journalist who's going undercover like Nellie Bly did to break this story. And Nellie Bly came to be known, like sort of, there was kind of a little cohort of these women at the turn of the previous century who came to be known as the girl stunt reporters. So stunt reporters were people that would do stunts like this and throw themselves into traffic and like put themselves in physical peril to get a good story. And these women trying to break into that male-dominated field found they had to go one step further than their male counterparts to make a name for themselves. So I kind of wanted to celebrate these girl stunt reporters. And so I've got Emily in 1961 doing effectively some detective work undercover. And at one point in the book, another character says to her, there's a reference to a woman police officer, and this is in 1961. And they're sort of going, wow, oh my goodness, what an idea, a woman police officer. And then 30 years later, in 1996, we have a woman detective. And it is difficult for her. She's facing sexism on the job. But in one generation, we now have a woman detective. So I wanted to sort of show that evolution of how women have fought for things like that. So that was one of the reasons I made my character detective. There were other sort of practical reasons for that. But I wanted to celebrate just those gains that we see that we don't always notice until we start to look for them when there have been gains. It's easy to see injustices, and it's important to see injustices, but it's also important to note when we've made progress somewhere. So I wanted to celebrate that with these women as well. And then, of course, we have Doris Anderson, as you said, who was the editor-in-chief of Chatelaine magazine from the 50s through the late 70s, and ended up leaving and going into politics because she was passed over for a promotion that a man got who had pretty much never set foot in the place. And she said, thank you very much, I'm going to go into politics, and never mind that. But she was so ahead of her time, like decades ahead of her time as a feminist and as a boss. I had the absolute honor and privilege of speaking to Michelle Landsberg and Adrienne Clarkson as part of my research process for this book.
Oh, wonderful.
They both knew Doris Anderson personally, and so I wanted to get a real sense of what was she like to know and what was she like as a boss. Adrienne Clarkson did book reviews for Chatelaine, and Michelle Landsberg wrote articles and worked in the office. And by all accounts, she was also an incredibly progressive boss and would understand with her mostly female staff had to leave early to pick up a sick child at school, or like kind of sounds like the origins of flex time. Like, again, decades ahead of her time. And she was heading a magazine at a time when women weren't really heading anything. There were no women-led banks, law firms, radio stations. Like, Chatelaine was it. She was so singular. So again, a person that I wanted to celebrate.
These novels also have really interesting familial dynamics going on. A lot of sort of mother-daughter or mentor-mentee, those kind of relationships. Could you talk a little bit about, working the tensions or sort of kind of giving a little bit of that texture to the lives of these incredible women that you're writing about?
I can't get into too much detail with mine in case something is let out of the bag.
No,
but
just the slightest.
But I can see it for this. A lot of what we write about and what I write about is interfamily sharing of stories and knowledge and experience, and how important it is that we not only read about history, but that we learn about it from people who have actually been through it. And I have the greatest regret that my grandparents all passed away when I really didn't care anything about what they did. And I look back now and think, oh, the questions I could have asked and looked into. In my books, sometimes I skip a generation, and it sort of shows how the grandmothers take care of the grandbabies in their absence, and how important it is to carry that on as well. Yeah, I'd like to say more, but
that makes sense.
Shall I rescue you?
Yeah.
So I'm going to talk two prongs. I think the mentorship is really interesting, and I'm going to come back to that. But just on the intergenerational family piece, those of you who know anything about me know that I'm also a therapist. So when I'm not a writer, half of my life is writing, half of my life is I have a psychotherapy practice, and I'm particularly interested in life transitions, in these hinge moments where we realize that we want to be something different than we are, or we want something really big in our life to change. And I think that in those moments, we really need guidance from mentors, from family members, and we want to look around us and see, does anyone have is anyone modeling anything that makes sense to me as a way forward? That's particularly true of marriage relationships, the relationships we grow up around. I think that maybe I will start with mentorship, actually. I'll come back to something else. At any stage in career, right, we need someone to guide us. We need someone to lead the way. Because it's very hard. There are some rare people who can just imagine a completely different life out of whole cloth, but most of us need to see someone modeling it for us. Something, it doesn't have to be an exact model, but it has to be something that makes us think, if you could do it, I could do it too. And I must say, I loved those sections in your book about Doris Anderson, because she was so powerfully that for so many women around her. And in this book, you can see that Maddie, the present-day woman, is missing mentors, right? And that is a big reason why she's flailing, because no one has kind of come alongside her and said, her academic supervisor has kind of let her down, and no one's come alongside her to say, let me help you find the next way forward. And she doesn't have a mom. Her mom's died. She's estranged from her dad, and she's someone who's really missing that. In the past, Helen is someone who's very unusual. All of the people doing the kind of jobs that she wants to do are men. Actually, she has a male mentor who's quite important to her on the dig, but he's got his own agenda, so there's that. But then Nora Alcott comes in, who, isn't a perfect mentor. Helen doesn't want to be someone's mistress, but she's very fascinated by this woman's kind of relationship with freedom, like a kind of freedom that just isn't available to most women. And she becomes very interested in figuring out, how can I get some version of intellectual, economic freedom for myself to make my own decisions. With respect to kind of like intergenerational family stuff and why it finds its way into books, I think, you immediately get dropped into so much more psychological depth when you pull people's parents and kids in, right? People always come into my office and they're like, why do my parents push my buttons so much? And I'm like, because they installed them. That's a psychotherapy joke that never gets old, And our kids do the same, right? The people that are most intimately close to us pull out of us our kind of most dysregulated selves. They really tap into our biggest fears about ourselves and our deepest frustrations and limitations. And when you can build that into a novel, suddenly you have a much bigger kind of psychological world to play in. And so, yeah, so I like to layer in lots of family relationships into my books.
I mean, Heather, your book is, it's partially set in a women's prison, and there are all of these different relationships kind of going on. So yeah, I mean, I guess similarly, and then Rachel has also a kind of a difficult, she's got a past that she's sort of trying to navigate. So could you talk a little bit about how that helped with the building this world?
Yeah, I mean, kind of alluding to what Kate was saying, family just makes good and easy drama. There's just, I mean, you get more than two people in a room together and you have politics, and when you get a family in a room together, there's so many layers of psychology and experience and feeling and emotion, and that makes people react in certain ways. So there's a lot to be harvested from that in terms of story. So in my 1996 timeline, I've got Rachel, who is the youngest of sort of three generations of women that are all uncomfortably cohabiting with each other. There's a lot of strife and drama and generational trauma to cope with. And that timeline, I can't say too much about how that family situation resolves. And then in terms of mentorship, yeah, I just wanted to celebrate Doris Anderson as this, I describe her as I pictured her like a mother swan. And she was so supportive of, she called them her girls, and her fledglings learning to fly. And I've also got kind of a little bit of a mirror to that in Rachel being kind of a mentor to an up-and-coming detective, who's also got a little bit of a past of his own that he's not quite ready to share with her yet. Also carrying some mental health baggage, and I just kind of wanted to play with that a lot in this book that has significant mental health themes. But in terms of intergenerational relationships and family and mentorship, it really just makes for the best drama. Yeah.
Okay.